Hello everyone, I'm here to discuss the analysis of today's The Hindu, The Indian Express and PIB. So without further ado, let's begin. The first article is about Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, whose Jayanti falls on 27th of June. It was mentioned in PIB that the PM paid homage to him on the day of Jayanti. So let us read about him. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee or Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay was an Indian novelist, poet and journalist. He was the composer of Vande Mataram, originally in Sanskrit, personifying India as a mother goddess and inspiring activists during the Indian independence movement. It is now the national song of India. Vande Mataram was a part of the book Anand Math written in 1882. The plot of the novel Anand Math is loosely set on the Sannyasi rebellion. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is also known as Sahitya Samrat in Bengali. The next article is an analysis of the global and domestic inflationary trends, and it tries to predict if the food will become costlier in our country in the times to come. So the article begins by talking about how the Brent crude oil prices have crossed the $75 mark per barrel. It further says that the FAO's World Food Price Index touched its highest value since September 2011. But unlike fuel, food price increase globally is not being reflected in what Indian consumers are paying. The annual CFPI or the Consumer Food Price Index inflation in India stood at 5% for the month of May, well below the 39.7% year-on-year rise in FAO's FPI for the same month. So why is there a spike in the international food prices? The spike in international food prices from September to October last year has been due to the demand returning with economies unlocking, even as the restoration of the supply chains is taking time. This has further been aided by Chinese stockpiling for building strategic reserves, as well as in anticipation of fresh corona outbreaks and dry weather-induced production shortfalls in Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, Thailand, and even the US. India, by contrast, has had good monsoon in 2019 as well as 20, making it the only agricultural powerhouse apart from Australia and Canada not to have faced serious weather-related issues. So not surprisingly, food inflation started falling from December last year with a bumper post-monsoon kharif crop being harvested and arriving in the markets. The table 2 in the given diagram gives a more detailed breakup of domestic retail food prices. These have gone up largely in edible oils and pulses, which are agricultural commodities that India significantly imports. So the country imports 13 to 15 million tons of edible oils every year and produces just 7.5 to 8.5 million tons. In pulses, domestic output has risen from 15 to 16 million ton to 22 to 23 million ton in the last 5 years. Although imports have also halved by 2.5 to 3.5 million ton, they still exert considerable influence on the domestic prices. So in the case of edible oil and pulses, there has been an automatic transmission of prices from the international to the domestic markets, similar to that in the fuel. Let us have a look at the causes of low domestic food inflation in India. So the relatively low domestic inflation in food items other than edible oil and pulses is attributed to: number 1, sufficient monsoon over the past 2-3 years. Number 2, the collapse of demand from successive COVID-triggered lockdowns. So with hotels, eateries, sweetmeat shops, hostels and canteens shut or operating at low capacity, besides no wedding receptions and other public functions, food demand has been confined mostly to households. The article mentions that food inflation in India in the coming months is likely to be influenced by the 4 determinants as mentioned. The first is edible oil and pulses, which India basically imports, and thus international prices play a significant role in that. The second is the monsoon's progress. India is supposed to have a normal monsoon in 2021, but nothing about the weather can be said for sure. The third is the extent of fuel cost increase being passed on to the consumers. So the article says that the fuel cost pass-through has taken place not by revising upwards the prices paid by consumers, but by lowering the prices paid to the producers. The article cites the example of milk. The next article talks about DMCA, the global act which was cited as a result of which the Twitter account of our IT minister was blocked for an hour on Friday. So let us read about DMCA in detail. DMCA stands for Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a 1998 law passed in US and is among the world's first laws recognizing intellectual property on the internet. It oversees the implementation of WIPO Copyright Treaty and WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty signed in December 1996. It provides protection to intellectual property that may be created by citizens of different nations which are signatories to the treaties. WIPO, or World Intellectual Property Organization, is a self-funding agency of the United Nations with 193 member states and is a global forum for intellectual property services. It was set up in 1967, long before the internet arrived. WIPO extended copyright and intellectual property protection to digital content in the wake of copying of content from websites across the world. Currently, users can approach the World Intellectual Property Organization for copyright claims. The article also mentions that every month, Facebook receives nearly 1 lakh such complaints. The next article talks about the high-level dialogue on energy, which the United Nations is set to convene in September 2021. The article says that NTPC is the first Indian energy company and currently among the few global firms to declare energy compact goals under the UN HLDE framework. HLDE, or the High-Level Dialogue on Energy, to be convened by the United Nations in September 2021, will be promoting the implementation of energy-related goals and targets the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So let us read about the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So to bring about sustainable development in the mainstream, the United Nations launched the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and SDGs in 2015. This universal, integrated, and transformative agenda aims to spur actions that will end poverty and build a more sustainable world over the next 15 years. There are 17 goals which have been mentioned and 169 targets to be achieved by 2030. SDGs are not legally binding. So this is the list of the 17 SDGs. You can take a screenshot. The next article is an RBI study which is not directly relevant from UPSC point of view, but some of the terms that have been mentioned here are of importance. So the RBI study mentioned in the article proposes to formally incorporate a RDGFD, which is revenue deficit in the gross fiscal deficit, and a revenue expenditure to capital outlay, which is RECO ceiling. RECO ratio of not more than 5% and the RDGFD ratio of not more than 40% for the general government, which is the center plus the states, is empirically found to be appropriate for the sustainable growth trajectory. RECO stands for Revenue Expenditure to Capital Outlay. So we'll break the term into two and read individually about revenue expenditure and capital outlay. So revenue expenditure is the expenditure for the normal running of government departments and various services, interest charges on the debt incurred by the government, subsidies, and so on. Broadly speaking, expenditure which does not result in the creation of assets is called revenue expenditure. On the contrary, capital expenditures or capital outlay means expenditure for the acquisition cost of capital assets such as equipments or expenditure to make improvements to capital assets that materially increase the value or useful life. So RDGFD stands for Revenue Deficit and Gross Fiscal Deficit Ratio. Revenue deficit is that which occurs when the government's total revenue expenditure exceeds its total revenue and receipts. A revenue deficit should not be confused with fiscal deficit. So if a government has a revenue deficit, it means that its income cannot cover its expenditure. A country's fiscal deficit, on the other hand, is the total money spent by the government in excess of its income, with the income figure including only the taxes and other revenues and excluding the money that the government has borrowed to make up for the shortfall. Revenue deficit can be calculated by subtracting total revenue expenditure from total revenue receipts. It is also important to note that the revenue receipts neither create liability nor lead to a reduction in assets. The GFD or gross fiscal deficit of a government is the surplus of its total expenditure, which means the current and the capital expenditure, as well as the loans net of recovery, above revenue receipts, and non-debt capital receipts. So this table here makes the difference between fiscal and revenue deficits clear. You can take a screenshot. Let us have a look at two previous year questions related to today's articles. So in the article that talked about food inflation in India, we talked about how globally Brent crude oil has crossed the $75 per barrel mark. So this UPSC 2020 prelims question says that the term West Texas Intermediate, sometimes found in news, refers to a grade of what? The options are crude oil, bullion, rare earth elements, or uranium. Correct answer is crude oil. So in the article we read about the Brent crude oil, which is another variety, and the other highest variety, which is the purest variety of petroleum, is the WTI or the West Texas Intermediate. This is a UPSC previous year question from 2011 prelim. Which one of the following statements appropriately describe the fiscal stimulus? Option A. It is a massive investment by the government in manufacturing sector to ensure the supply of goods to meet the demand surge caused by rapid economic growth. Option B. It is an intense affirmative action of the government to boost economic activity in the country. Option C. It is government's intensive action on financial institutions to ensure disbursement of loans to agriculture and allied sectors to promote greater food production and contain food inflation. Option D. It is an extreme affirmative action by the government to pursue its policy of financial inclusion. So the correct answer is option B. Fiscal stimulus basically means when the government is trying to boost the economic activity in the country by spending. The last question of today is also from 2011 prelims. Consider the following actions which the government can take: devaluing the domestic currency, reduction in export subsidy, adopting suitable policies which attract FDI and more funds from foreign institutional investment. Which of the above action or actions can help in reducing the current account deficit? So let us analyze each option separately. So by devaluing the domestic currency, the government is basically giving impetus to the exports and is deterring the imports. The exports of the country are going to become more competitive because now the exporters or the producers of this country are going to offer the products at a very competitive price in the international market. So the first option is correct. The second option says reduction in the export subsidy. This is false because by reducing the subsidy, exports will be deterred. And if the imports remain the same, the current account deficit will only widen. Let us look at the third option. So adopting suitable policies which attract greater FDI and more funds from FIIs. So when FDIs or foreign direct investments flow in our country, basically it is the foreign money that is getting invested in our country. This is bound to reduce the current account deficit. So the third option is also correct. So our answer will be option D. Both 1 and 3 are true. So that's all for today from my side. Do write in the comment section if you have any queries regarding a particular topic. Thank you so much.